Right, looks like we are live now. Perfect.
Yay.
Yay. Hi, everyone. And yeah, welcome to the Grow Better panel, where we'll talk about things that didn't really take up much time in the book, but we are talking about them anyway, because we like them. That's what everybody does here. So yeah, I'm Lisa. Spoil the vines on wherever you want to. Yeah, I'll talk about parks and stuff. And Lauren?
Yeah, I'm Lauren. I'm at Ditherwings on Twitter, and I really love plants. I work in an indoor garden space right now. I am not, however, a botanist or horticulturist, so I am just an enthusiastic amateur. But I'm really excited to talk about plants with you and to try and answer your questions. So definitely feel free to use the Q&A box, and we'll see if we can get around to answering some of those questions.
Yeah, and as we found out during preparation, we have more than 1 hour material worth. So like, we'll try to squeeze as much as we can, but on that, I guess we can just jump straight in, and I'm going to try not to present the Excel events page because that's gonna be weird. And yeah, come in, and yeah, it should be there. Perfect. So yeah, we've already said who we are and what we're doing. So yeah, I'm just going on. So yeah, as I've said, there aren't really a lot of plant mentions in Good Omens. So like in preparation for this thing, I kind of went through the whole script book, like speed reading that. And like if you don't count locations, there are just 16 mentions of plants. Like if you don't count stuff like broccoli foam and things like that are clearly like food designated. 16 mentions, out of which 8 are just anonymous Crowley misting some houseplants. So like that's not really concrete. So like this is literally everything plant related that appears in the script. So like we have a bunch of places, like obviously they have Eden, and we have things like St. James's Park and like Dowling's Garden and so on and so forth. And we have like a few plant mentions, most that we are going to cover, but it's not a lot really. Like you, yeah, as I said, here we are anyway. So yeah, I'll basically start and talk about the locations that appeared in the show. Berkeley Square, where like the final swap happened, St. James's Park, which we all hopefully know and love by now, and the park around the bandstand, which, unlike what the script is suggesting, is not St. James's Park. And yeah, then Lauren will talk about many, many more cool things about apples, gardening, house plants, and what I think everybody's here for, Crowley shouting at plants. And yeah, again, if we have time, like we'll cover more weird stuff, or we'll answer questions, or we'll post that stuff like on Twitter or whatever. So yeah, hopefully that'll be interesting for everyone. And yeah, let's jump even straighter in. So yeah, most of the action in the book actually happens in like quite small quarters, like in central London. Like you've got Soho with the bookshop and the Zero Fail. You have Mayfair with Crowley, which is like right across a very posh street, basically. We've got St. James Park, which is like, what, 10 minutes away walking from like both Soho and Mayfair, like if you look at the borders. And we have Berkeley Square right in the middle of Mayfair. 2 minutes away is the Ritz. And that's literally like all the actually like mentioned locations, apart from like the British Museum that's like mentioned in one line in the book, one line in the show. It's like 10 minutes from here to the north. That's it, close quarters. To warm up, I'm going to start with Berkeley Square because it's the shorter and it also like brings a nice introduction. So yeah, Berkeley Square, it's a fairly typical thing for like a London green place to be developed like Berkeley Square did. So basically most of London started a bit further to like the west from here, like across the Thames. So this was all really like a kind of useless farmland till like quite far along in like country and city's history, till like roughly the end of the mid 17th century. what happened in mid-17th century, some guy decided to buy it because like it was decent farmland, like the area around. He built a posh house there, and then he was like, cities come in here. I guess I don't really need the posh house anymore. I can sell that to somebody who has even more money, and like on the farmland that I own, I can build more houses and like sell them to more people, and that will be really, really cool for me while I'll retire to some whatever like countryside with all that fairly earned money, which was like a thing people did. So in 1696, like the current owner, like Lord of Berkeley, I'm pretty much sure that's the name, sold the house that was roughly here to another duke. It doesn't really matter, but what mattered is that so the person who sold that still kept owning the farmland around that, and he wanted to build houses there, but he promised that he won't obstruct the view from the house to like the northwest. It's the northwest, yeah. And like he'll keep the green space so it's nice for the people who live in the posh house. And that's quite literally what happens. Like for the next 30-40 years, like all these houses around were built. This is the map from 1799. Everything was pretty much like it is these days, except like this thing also has like more buildings there. And yeah, it's a really boring square if you look at the history, because like it's not pretty. Like photo from yesterday, it looks like that. Trees, grass, stuff. All right. Like some of the buildings are new, like they're not really uniform. So yeah, why was I talking about that if it's boring? There is a very important thing about this, because if you look at the trees, like that you can see on the picture, they're all the same tree, like this, it's the same species. That's something called the London plane. And plane as in like the aircraft, it's written the same, but it's the tree. So this tree is sort of a hybrid tree that appeared. Nobody really knows when and why. It's a hybrid from like one plane species from America and another plane species from like Southeast Asia that like randomly met somewhere in Europe, and nobody really knows why. But the first tree of the species like was introduced to a bishop in Cambridgeshire in like 1663, and he decided it was cool and planted like 2 trees in his back garden. And then people came to his back garden and said, oh, it's a nice tree. And so let's actually talk a bit about the tree in particular, because like if you want to identify it, you might want to look at the like leaves, and it looks like a maple, but not a maple, but almost a maple, but not really. But like it's like the leaves are not something you look at if you want to identify it. You want to look at the bark, which is quite characteristical in terms of it's spotty. There are like parts falling off of it. It's like a camouflage really. So like some of the bits are fairly new and smooth and like almost don't have any bark at all. It's like almost like tree skin. What's the word? And this is actually really, really helpful for this tree to survive, because normally like for a tree to basically live a long and happy life, it should be able to exchange gases from inside the tree with the external atmosphere. And trees normally do that through like holes in the bark. So if something covers the bark completely, or like something happens in the air and the air gets polluted with, I don't know, maybe soot or something like that, what happens is the pores in the bark get blocked. The tree can't breathe. It gets sick. It might die. It's basically not good for the tree. The air pollution was like a thing in like 19th century London. It's like more or less apocryphal these days. So when people would plant trees around, they basically noticed that like these trees aren't dying very quickly, unlike all the others. So again, what I've said, they were first introduced in like late 17th century, and by the early 19th century, they became a really popular planting tree in the city. They also look quite posh and intimidating when they grow. So at some point, 60% of London was covered in these trees. And again, they weren't dying because if the bark gets blocked, they just shed the bark and they're doing fine and nicely. Very adaptable, very cute. they are not at 60% of London trees anymore. It's like 4% of them now, because monocultures in cities aren't a great idea, because like in case they get sick, you lose all the trees. But still, like an iconic tree. They basically, lots of other cities realized that they're cool for the environment and polluted cities. There are lots of them in Paris, Rome, New York, whatever, pretty much everywhere really. And yeah, so as I've said, so these trees were planted by like a local resident in 1789 who was like, wouldn't it be nice if I plant some trees? And he did. So these are actually the oldest plane trees in London right now. So it's at 240 years. And plane trees normally like grow till they're 300 years old, and then they kind of go into decline. Although since the hybrid is new, nobody has ever really seen one die from an old age. So maybe it's longer, you never know. But yeah, it was kind of recognized that like, one of the trees in particular was deemed to be like the coolest of them all, although they're like the same age, but most of them have like one single trunk, and this one has like 3 of them, which is nice. And it was put on basically, London has a list of like really cool and old trees that you shouldn't cut and like you should admire and love. There are like 60 trees in that. It's on the list. It's called, obviously, Berkeley Plain, because nobody's going to be original here. And yeah, it's a cute tree. It's a bit intimidating. It's really large. Like if you can look at the benches, it's big. And yeah, it also was like in 2008, I think, there was this thing where like some charity basically decided to figure out how much are different trees in London worth based on like how old are they, how large are they, how like helpful are they for the climate, and stuff like that. And this particular tree was priced at just £750,000, which was like $1 million at the time. Cool, sure, $1 million worth of tree, nice. So yeah, that's Berkeley Square for us. And like, even though it didn't really play much in the, like appear much in the book or in the plot really, it's important. And yeah, it's a nice place. Yeah, moving on, St. James Park, which is something that definitely appears much more, and like, I think like for me personally, it's like the second most frequent location, like at least in my head, after Aziraphale's bookshop, so there is that. So yeah, to talk about St. James Park, we need to like look at the streets around here a little bit to like understand where did it start really. Because like if you look at streets around Mayfair here, you can kind of notice that they form in like a grid, kind of like there's a parallel, there's a kind of parallel, and it's not Manhattan style grid, but it's still, reasonable. But like this streets here are actually a bit weird. And it's not about like, it's not because somebody was feeling fancy and just did that. It's because there used to be a river there, like River Tyburn, flowing like from a hill to the north of here, and doing quite fine really. It just, like, nobody really knows like where it like was flowing like around this area, but like probably it like made a turn here and then it flowed into Thames. So you take this place, right? Nobody lives here, like in, let's talk about like 1500, something like that. Everybody lives further to the west. There is a river here, there is a river here, there are more rivers here. And like this place, oh, sorry, spoilers. This place didn't really have any choice than like to become a marshland. I mean, Gibbs gets flooded by the rivers. Everything's nice and fine. Nobody wants to live here except for like a leper hospital that was like located here and named, you guessed that, St. James Leper Hospital. But times change, London grows, and so by the like, I have years written down here. Oh yeah, so by like 1530s, the king kind of like has been living here like for a while, and so there are a couple of palaces here, and that's a marshland, and that's a bit of a waste of space. And so yeah, back to spoilers. Their husband Henry VIII, I don't like his face, so I didn't put his face in here. He like in addition to being known for the wives, he was also fairly known for like buying land and turning that into deer hunting things, because like, what do you do with your free time? You know, you kill wives, you hunt deer. That's good time. And so yeah, he bought the land from, it belonged to Eton College at the time for some reason. He bought it, he like made it less of a wetland, he brought some deer in, he built a fence, and yeah, hunted deer, and then he died. Nice story. But yeah, so it was like kind of considered like not a royal park. There wasn't really a concept like that at the time, but like it was land that belonged to the crown. Nothing happened there much till like over 100 years, so like till 1660. Charles II, sorry for the memes. Charles II basically came back into power, come back from being exiled in France, and he was like, okay, we have a palace and we also have like ground nearby. And I saw in France there are all those like posh and nice gardens, like symmetrical, you know, pretty proper classes, whatever. Yeah, let's do something like that on this useless deer hunting thingy. And yeah, that's what happened. We got 3 very exciting rows of trees, a very exciting row of tree here, a very exciting row of tree here, and an even more exciting row of trees here, with like a canal in the middle, so like the dogs could swim there or whatever. It's like, yeah, it's 1660. Yeah, everybody liked it though, because like that was in fashion. Some people apparently thought it was boring, or like maybe it was for another reason, but 4 years later after this opened, the Russian ambassador decided that what this park really, really needs are a bunch of pelicans. Because, I mean, why not give the king pelicans? Pelicans are cute. This is actually a tradition that like happens to this day. So like every once in a while, like somebody will gift the current monarch a few pelicans, and they'll get put into the St. James's Park, because that's a thing that's done apparently. I don't even know. Yeah, so yeah, pelicans. Sorry, more pelicans. Crowley masquerading as a swan, drowning ducks, whatever. Yesterday's shot. The next thing that happens historically to St. James Park is that Aziraphale moves in Soho in 1800. And more map looking, because I like old maps, and this is a really cool map. Soho, posh people are moving out of Soho, Aziraphale is moving into Soho, posh people are moving into Mayfair, Crowley moved into Mayfair, everything's reasonable. And then like 10 minutes away from like each of them really is a park that's like, it sounds like a nice place for them to meet and, you know, hang out, but it's boring. It's not even in fashion anymore, because like it's been like what, like over 100 years, 150 years, can't do math. So yeah, not just him, it's not just like them, apparently, I don't know, imagine who think that. So in 1897, the park gets like heavily remodeled, like the symmetrical thingies are not in vogue anymore, and like all the 19th century is really about like things that are in fashion, you know. So the park gets like rebuilt in like more natural shapes. There are more birds. They are into logical societies, like there are lots of cool birds here. Can I build a house and like put a bird keeper in there? And everybody says, yeah, that's cool. So they build a house like that. Duck Cottage, it's called. Still there. And yeah, nothing changes much. They build a bridge, and this basically means that like by the 1867, the park is pretty much as it is to this day. Like nothing has really changed apart of like really small details, like some trees were dug out, some trees were planted, really small ones, and like, you know, other smaller things. In the short, everything is like surprisingly historically accurate, except for this set photo, which has a monument that didn't exist till 1914, but it's not in the show, so that's fine. I can live with that. So yeah, very quickly, I'm gonna cover like a few cool trees in the park, because they're cool and I like trees, if you noticed so far. So first, there are, well, actually, like it has to be prefaced that like since the park was built in 1827, and if you have been listening, I've said that plane trees were really popular in 19th century London. more than half of the trees in the park are plane trees planted in 1827. So it's kind of boring except for like a few bits. So first thing is there are quite a lot of well, by quite a lot, I mean 4, but that's actually quite a lot of mulberries compared to the usual amount of 0 to 1. So mulberries were actually like, there was some sort of a mulberry fever, basically, metaphorically speaking, when James I was the king, because he was like, let's make silk industry in London, in the UK, really popular. So he brought in quite a lot of like mulberry trees and heavily encouraged everyone to plant them so that the bugs can eat the berries, produce cocoons, and people can make silk from them, and London can become the capital of like the silk producing empire. Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. Right. It didn't work out, basically. Nobody really knows why. There is like a theory that it was because he chose the wrong mulberry plant, and like out of 2 very similar subspecies, he basically chose the black mulberries that the bugs don't like. I don't know, sounds like a small devil-ish issue to me, but whatever. There were a couple of them, they're cute. Lives like that. I don't know. If you want to ID a plant, honestly, just maybe download an app and look it up. But yeah, that's how a mulberry leaf looks like. Yeah, I'll jump through that really, really quickly. So like another really nice tree that was in St. James Park till actually this winter, as I found out yesterday, is a medlar tree. So these are like rose relatives with basically edible fruit. Like this thing is that look kind of like roses, apples, whatever. Like they're all relatives. The fun thing about them is like like quite a few different tree species. You can't actually eat them when they look nice like that. They are not ripe yet, so you need to wait for them to get frozen on the branch, and then you want them to like start fermenting, like almost rotten a bit, and then they look like they're garbage, and then you can eat them. Demonic food, whatever. The medlar in St. James Park looked like that, and like if it isn't a masquerading demon, I don't know what is. Unfortunately, as I found out yesterday, it doesn't exist anymore. They dug it out. There is a nice one nearby, but yeah, whatever. Not that pretty anymore. And yeah, very, very short addition. Aziraphale mentioned that he likes pears, and yeah, like pear-shaped things are supposed to be not good things because, like, fat bottom, whatever metaphor. My proposal, like, there are no pear trees in St. James Park, but there are fig trees. So fig-shaped would kind of be the same because it's like the same shape, really, like really. And there is a fairly large fig tree guarded by 2 geese in the corner. It's a bit intimidating, really, because like normally they aren't that big, and it's like the 2nd largest, I think, in London. The first one is somewhere like in a private house, whatever. But yeah, it's a fig tree, and if you are ever in the need of a fig leaf, you can maybe steal it from there, although that's not allowed because that's a royal park and you can't do these things. Yeah, so if you actually read the script book carefully, you can see that like Crowley and Aziraphale are talking about meeting at the 3rd alternative rendezvous, which is the bandstand, which we all know and dread, love, I don't know. But when they actually meeting, the script describes this as meeting by the duck pond at St. James's Park. So you like probably most of you know that it wasn't actually shot there. It was shot in a different place. Like my first thought was that I don't know, they just didn't have enough money, but like initially they were planning to shoot that in St. James's Park. So I was like, yeah, let's find the bandstand. I started looking for a bandstand, and I found this St. James Park Bloom bandstand. Sounds fair, looks all right. Although I don't recognize the building in the back because like it's not something that exists in London, I think. If you look closer, that's St. James Park, Toronto, Canada. There is no bandstand in St. James's Park, unlike most like that Victorian-aged parks in London. I don't know why it doesn't appear in the book. Maybe Neil also Googled it and didn't check his facts. But yeah, I mean, this is like the closest thing to the bandstand. So like maybe theoretically they could have shot something like that in the duck cottage. I mean, duck cottage. Sounds all right. I'll do that. But yeah, yeah, I think I'll try to rush through that quite quickly. But yeah, so it ended up being shot in Battersea Park. The bandstand actually isn't that like black and depressing. It's actually colorful and kind of cute. Yeah, very quickly, like we've been quite in the center of London so far, and most of the action, again, as I've said in the book and in the script, happens roughly there. Like they don't move around much. So like the Battersea Park is quite far away, and there is not much reason like why would they meet there, because it's kind of a local park, and normally like people who visit it are people who live in the area. So I tried to figure out how that happened, and in the list of like rendezvous points, they also mention bus number 910, on which they meet presumably in like first episode. Bus number 910 goes past Soho, Mayfair, St. James Park, and then it goes straight to Battersea Park. So maybe that's why. I don't know though, like I really don't know. But that's like one plausible idea. But yeah, very short. So we were talking about St. James Park, and it was done in like 1827. This is like how Battersea Park looked like in that time. Like there wasn't really anything. Like South Bank was kind of useless. There was like a giant marsh. There was a tavern with people doing like gambling and like illegal, whatever, everything legal nearby. People were just dueling here if they wanted to. Like there were a couple of like really well-known duels in like 1829 or something. Looked like that, like a wetland basically, like average London wetland, marshland, whatever, like with lavender and asparagus growing there. Nothing like very exciting, but like a nice place that honestly would have probably turned into like a nature reserve if it was done today. But Victorian London, people like changing things and turning them into things they think like basically turning everything into order according to what they think is the order. So yeah, there were quite a lot of docklands being developed, like being dug out basically by the shore on the Thames, like around that time. So there was lots of like spare dirt basically. So like somebody very, very talented was like, we need dirt here, we have dirt there, let's just burn it, turn it into like a plain, and I don't know, let's build a park there. That's maybe like make this more cultured. And yeah, they basically made a park, and it wasn't really anything special, like your average Victorian park. They built the bandstand like around the same time, so it was like 1857. Actually, yeah, I actually remembered correctly, 1858. Yeah, park, nothing special, people walking around, locals mostly. In the like early 20th century, it was mostly turned into like a place for allotments, like for local people to grow vegetables, really, because like 2 world wars didn't really like come gently at the place. Nothing really happened there till 1951. So 1951 was quite a big year in Britain, because like 100 years ago, there was a great exhibition in Hyde Park, and it was like one of those great exhibitions that are like that produced Eiffel Tower in Paris, like a few decades after that. So it will like the government basically decided that after the Second World War, that's really something that's like ought to be celebrated for people to have a bit fun, because like 50s weren't really fun in the UK at all. So yeah, they ran something called Festival of Britain with like lots of locations around the island. Most of them were kind of educational. This one was not. This one was like, let's let people have fun somewhere, at least that'll be all right. There was like a model railway that you can run and actually still learn something there. But like there were fountains, there were like chandeliers, cool night lighting. There was a dance pavilion, whatever. Like it was nice, people had fun. It took over like half the park, and it was a really popular place. Like they didn't actually demolish this right away, so they lasted till the 60s or something. And some things like you can still see there, like at least like in some form. But yeah, it's a nice local park. Come visit, but like there is nothing special except for the bandstand. Yeah, the only important thing about the bandstand that you have to know is that it's actually an approved wedding location since 2015. So like cosplay purposes, fan fiction purposes, real life purposes. That needs to be remembered. And that has been a very sped run introduction into some of the perks that happen. And at this, I'll stop presenting because that's my main stuff, and I'll just mute myself. I think Lauren's trying to present.
All right, so I'm going to start at the beginning in the garden. Hopefully you can see my screen here. All right, so Eden is described as being sort of a paradise. It's an allegory for a place of perfection and closeness to God. And we saw it in the show depicted as kind of a walled space, and it was full of different vegetation that looked like it maybe didn't necessarily belong in the same climate. And it sort of reminded me of this popular depiction of it in art, this painting by Thomas Cole. And you can see the waterfalls and pools, kind of like in the television series. And of course, the other thing that is featured in Eden is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So how did we come to associate that with apples? Apples are plants that prefer a temperate climate. Each flower, when pollinated, produces a single fruit. And those fruits can vary widely in size, color, texture, and all of that just depends on the variety of the apple. There are a lot more varieties than you see in the store. Generally, there are somewhere in the range of 15 apple varieties that you might see in a grocery store, whereas there are upwards of 8,000 varieties of apple throughout history. They're popular to depict in art and writing, and they generally symbolize things like youth, fertility, renewal, knowledge, and beauty. And you can see that in folklore, mythology, fairy tales. I find it interesting that they also tend to kind of be catalysts when they show up in stories. So for example, in the stories of Atalanta or Snow White, when the apple shows up in the story, suddenly the plot takes a sharp turn. In Snow White's case, that is when the curse befalls Snow White. And in Atalanta's case, it is the apple being thrown into her path that slows her down in the race that she is running. In Norse mythology, they are what keeps the gods youthful and immortal. There is, of course, the story of Paris having to decide between three goddesses and award an apple to the most beautiful goddess. He gives it to Aphrodite, and a series of events happen that spin out from that ultimately result in the Trojan War. So apples being associated with beauty. So how did they become the forbidden fruit? The fruit is only called a fruit in biblical texts. It doesn't get associated directly with apples until I think it's the 4th century, when the text is translated into Latin in the Vulgate Bible. The Latin word for apple is malus, and the Latin word for evil is also malus. So it's basically a pun that was so good that it just stuck around and became embedded in popular culture. Other contenders for the forbidden fruit include things like grapes, figs, pomegranates, wheat, apricots, various citrus fruits, including grapefruit, and pears. So let's talk about the Dowlings' garden now that we've covered the Garden of Eden. Brother Francis doesn't actually seem to do a whole lot of gardening. He is described as never actually picking up a shovel, but having a great rapport with all of the creatures that wander into the garden. So let's talk about those creatures. Specifically, Brother Pigeon, Brother Snail, and Sister Slug. Are these things that gardeners would have a rapport with? So pigeons are not ideal. They like to eat plants. They will peck up seeds from the ground, including seeds you are trying to grow. And they will just generally cause some havoc. They do also eat insects though. So if you can persuade the pigeon not to eat your brassica plants, they might get rid of some pests for you. So maybe Brother Francis just had a very firm conversation about what pigeons were and were not allowed to eat. Slugs and snails also consume a huge amount of vegetation in gardens. They can be really destructive, but they also will eat garden detritus, decomposing vegetation. So they're helpful in that regard, but they're not really something you're going to be thrilled to see in your garden. That said, there are a lot of insects that are helpful. Integrated pest management, or IPM, I think is a gardening strategy that Brother Francis would approve of. It involves managing pests without the use of chemicals. You basically identify what pests are present and then pick out a beneficial insect to help you control that pest population. So a really good example that's fairly common is if you have an aphid infestation in your garden, if you introduce ladybugs, they will help you control that aphid population because they're the natural predators for aphids. Let's talk a little bit about the history of houseplants. I'm trying to limit my scope a little bit. I had a lot of material, so I'm going to be talking specifically about England and more modern history. In the 17th century, plants which had been brought into the house a lot for culinary and medicinal use get used more for ornamentation. And people start talking a little bit more about houseplants. There was a book published called Flore's Paradise or The Garden of Eden, which was probably the first text that really got into how to grow plants indoors. People would use chimneys during the summertime when they weren't using those chimneys for fires as a place to grow plants. They had something called bough pots, which were placed in the chimney and used as basically a very large flower pot. There was a lot of interest in getting plants to grow and flower during the winter time. And that continued into the 18th century. You can see this row of hyacinths in these special glasses. These were really popular during the 18th century. You'd see them made out of glass and ceramic. And the goal was basically to get hyacinths and crocuses to flower unseasonably. And they were very much the fashion in people's homes. Building styles changed during this period as well. window structures allowed more light in, and they also accommodated things like windowsills and balconies as more of a standard, which made a great space for growing plants. Also of note, Wedgwood did open a showroom in Soho at this time with a dedicated flower pot room. And you can see some examples of Wedgwood flower pots here. I especially love the hedgehog planter there. In the 19th century, there was a huge interest in botany, and there were a lot of fads surrounding plants. Plants were very fashionable. The first of these fads was orchid mania. In 1818, William Swainson used some orchid plants as packing material, and the recipient of that package cultivated the orchids and successfully got them to flower, which basically fired up the imagination of the public, and there was a huge excitement around orchids, which led to a lot of orchid species being classified, but also led to a lot of destruction of their habitats. Orchids are incredibly specialized, and it is unfortunately very easy to wipe them out to extinction because they are so endemic to a particular geographic location that often is very small. In 1845, the glass tax was repealed, so more people were able to build greenhouses and conservatories. After orchid mania died off a bit, there was also a mania for ferns, and following that one for palms. And those actually became popular design motifs. You can see here a Wardian case. These were developed during that time period, and they're kind of like modern terrariums. They just made growing plants a little bit easier. After that, interest in houseplants kind of died off for a little while. With the fashion for modernism, there weren't a lot of houseplants that were popular, excepting cacti and rubber plants. With Scandinavian design, interest in houseplants came back a little bit. All right, let's talk about Crowley's houseplants. So I am not an expert in plant ID, but I was able to get one of the docents at my workplace to try and help me identify some of Crowley's plants. We're not really sure all of them are analogous to real plants, but our best guesses were that the big ones, they kind of look like maybe a combination between Dracaena trees and bird of paradise plants. And then the smaller plants that are around the base of those larger planters might be Dieffenbachia, but we're not sure. As for the small plant, the one that just can't cut it and is about to meet a terrible fate of going down the garbage disposal, it is probably an anthurium or a juvenile Monstera deliciosa. The juvenile plants don't have those trademark holes in their leaves, and they do look quite like the one Crowley's holding. So in the book, it's mentioned that Crowley yelling at his plants has an origin in something that he heard in the early 70s on Radio 4. And I think that what he probably heard about was a discussion of a book that was a bestseller. It was published in 1973. It was called The Secret Life of Plants. And it was a pseudoscientific work that hugely captured public imagination. It described a series of experiments where plants were hooked up to a polygraph, and then people would do things like threaten them or say nice things to them, play music for them, There was an instance where someone stomped on a plant in front of the plant that was hooked up in front of the polygraph and then measured the stress response. None of the experiments were replicable, and this book kind of haunts the scientific community of those who study plants to this day. So, how do plants actually respond to threats, and can they hear? Heidi Appel, who was a researcher from the University of Missouri, recently did an experiment where she played the vibrational sound of a caterpillar chewing to an Arabidopsis plant. Arabidopsis will produce a chemical defense. It's called glucosinolates, and this plant responded to the caterpillar chewing with that chemical defense. So it basically created the chemicals that give mustard green their kick in response to the sound of the caterpillar chewing. And it didn't react to other more benign sounds. We know that there are plants that are also adapted to creating sweeter nectar in response to the vibration of pollinators' wings, even if those insects are not directly on the plant. Plants communicate with one another through chemical signals passed through the air or through a web of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi. And some of the plant species can also pass on messages with chemicals to other insects. So if they're getting attacked by pests, they will draw in helpful insects that will then eat those pests. So, is talking to your plant or playing music for it or even yelling at it helpful? Not directly. We don't have any evidence that plants actually enjoy music or us singing to them or talking to them. However, if you are doing those things, you are spending more time with your plant, you're paying attention to it, you're not just watering it and walking away. So you're more likely to notice health issues. So ultimately, yes, I think talking to your plant is beneficial. Here's our information if you'd like to get in touch with us. And thank you very much. I'd love to hear your theories on Crowley's houseplants.
Do we still have time? We still have a bit of time.
Yes.
And there were like, what? Oh, there were 2 questions. Nice. Nice.
Ooh.
So, all right. How would we portray frightened plants on TV? Lol, sorry. Lauren?
I think that they did a really good job in the show. Normally, I would say that you would have the plant maybe wilt or do something like that. But if the plants wilt, Crowley will just be more angry. So I think shaking makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, right. Like, it was good, I agree. Like, maybe something like, you know, some weird animatic might have done the job, but I have no idea how could that look like, you know, traveling inside the plant's brain, like the internet thingy, where you're like inside, but I don't know. I don't know.
Yep.
Right, I guess this was Answered Live. Do we have any favorite plants?
Ooh, I do. My favorite plant is the Begonia ferox, which is a very weird species of begonia from southwestern China, I think, that has these spiky formations called bullae on the leaves. They're very mysterious. We don't know exactly what they're for, but it makes it a very fascinating looking plant.
Nice. I'm trying to limit myself in terms of like liking houseplants because I have 2 cats and most of the houseplants are poisonous to pets in general, and mine are stupid. And they actually eat pretty much everything. So like any plant that appears here like is bound to be eaten. So I'm like limiting myself to only liking houseplants that like my cats can eat. The calatheas, like in general as a family, are really cool because first they're stripy and nice, and second, like all plants move to some extent, but with calatheas you actually notice that they're like moving throughout the day from like completely vertical leaves to completely horizontal, and that's a bit creepy but also nice. And like if you put them like near a wall, you can literally hear the leaves moving sometimes. That's nice. And I also really like linden trees, like lime trees. I don't know why, they just smell nice. Yeah. And those were the live questions. And I'm not sure if we're supposed to wrap up right now, or we can have like, I don't know. Do people want to hear about ashes? Do I want to talk about ashes? Yeah, that won't be streamed, I guess, for a bunch of seconds, so I won't get an answer soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, I guess we should just wrap up. That was a good point. I'll post the remaining stuff on Twitter, basically. So if you're curious to hear like about my ideas on like what the Great Ash Hath Fallen prediction could have meant, and a couple of more detective stories about trees in London, probably there, like by the end of the day, there will be something there. It might be interesting. It might be not. But yeah.
And if you're interested in lots of pictures of plants from my workplace, definitely check out my Instagram account because it is entirely plant pictures.
On that, yeah.
Yep. All right. Thank you all.